What if the most important geopolitical battle in North America wasn't being fought with tariffs, speeches, or trade agreements? What if it was being fought with something far more powerful? Capital. Not the kind that appears on television, not the kind politicians debate in front of cameras, but the kind that quietly changes the direction of nations. Because while headlines focused on Donald Trump's tariff threats, trade disputes, and increasingly aggressive rhetoric toward Canada, something extraordinary was happening behind closed doors. Something few people noticed, something that may ultimately prove far more significant than any tariff battle. While Washington was trying to apply pressure, Canada was building an escape route. And by the time American policymakers began to understand what was happening, the architecture was already taking shape. Not in New York, not in Washington, but thousands of miles away, across the Atlantic, in the sovereign wealth capitals of the Persian Gulf. Today, we're going to examine one of the most fascinating economic stories unfolding right now. A story about power, a story about money, and a story about how Canada may be quietly redesigning its place in the global financial system. For decades, the relationship between Canada and the United States operated according to a simple reality. Canada needed America more than America needed Canada. The United States was Canada's largest trading partner, its largest export market, its largest source of investment, its largest economic influence. More than 70% of Canadian exports traditionally flowed south. Entire industries were integrated across the border. Automotive manufacturing, energy, agriculture, technology, financial services. The economic relationship became so deeply intertwined that many policymakers in Washington began viewing Canadian alignment as almost automatic. Canada was considered stable, predictable, reliable, and perhaps most importantly, dependent. That assumption shaped decades of American thinking. If pressure was applied, Canada would adjust. If market access was threatened, Canada would negotiate. If tariffs appeared, Canada would seek compromise. Historically, that approach often worked, because geography itself reinforced the relationship. The world's longest undefended border, massive trade volumes, integrated supply chains, shared infrastructure, shared security arrangements, shared economic interests. From Washington's perspective, the leverage seemed permanent. But history repeatedly teaches one lesson. The greatest strategic mistakes often emerge when powerful nations begin believing existing advantages can never change. And that may be exactly what happened here. Because while political leaders focused on trade disputes, a much deeper transformation was beginning. A transformation involving the movement of global capital. And capital has a unique characteristic. Unlike factories, pipelines, or highways, capital moves quickly, quietly, and often long before politicians realize what is happening. At the center of this story stands Prime Minister Mark Carney. Unlike many political leaders, Carney's background was not primarily political, it was financial. He spent years inside the machinery of global finance. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada, then became governor of the Bank of England. Few political leaders anywhere in the world possess that combination of experience. Carney understands something many politicians do not. Modern power is increasingly determined by financial architecture. Not just military strength, not just trade volumes, not just diplomatic influence, but the ability to attract, direct, and retain global capital. Because in the 21st century, capital finances everything. Energy projects, artificial intelligence infrastructure, data centers, mining operations, transportation networks, advanced manufacturing, research facilities, economic growth itself. And if you can redirect capital flows, you can redirect the future. That understanding appears to have influenced Canada's response to growing American pressure. Instead of escalating publicly, instead of matching rhetoric with rhetoric, instead of engaging in a headline-driven confrontation, the strategy appears to have focused on something far more fundamental. Reducing vulnerability, building alternatives, expanding options, creating new sources of investment beyond traditional North American channels. Because true leverage only exists when alternatives are limited. The moment alternatives emerge, leverage begins to weaken. This is where the story becomes especially interesting. Across the Gulf region, several sovereign wealth funds control trillions of dollars in assets. These institutions are unlike traditional investors. They do not think in quarters. They do not think in election cycles. They often think in decades. Some of the world's largest pools of capital are managed by institutions connected to countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. These funds continuously search for opportunities that combine three critical characteristics: stability, resource access, long-term growth potential, and Canada possesses all three. Political stability, enormous natural resources, strong institutions, abundant energy, critical minerals, advanced technological capabilities, massive freshwater resources, and access to global markets. According to the transcript, discussions evolved from exploratory conversations into broader investment frameworks spanning energy, infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and critical minerals. Individually, these investments might not seem revolutionary, but collectively, they create something much larger: an ecosystem, a network of interconnected economic relationships. And that is where the strategic implications become profound. Because when investments begin connecting multiple sectors simultaneously, they stop functioning as isolated transactions. They become architecture. Most people focus on tariffs because tariffs are visible. They make headlines. They create political drama. They generate immediate reactions. Capital flows operate differently. They are often invisible until years later. A tariff can increase costs, but a billion-dollar investment can create entirely new industries. A tariff can influence trade, but capital can influence development. A tariff can slow growth, but capital can accelerate it. The transcript repeatedly emphasizes a critical point: pressure does not always create compliance. Sometimes pressure encourages diversification. History provides countless examples. Countries facing uncertainty often seek alternative suppliers, alternative markets, alternative investors, alternative partnerships. Not necessarily because they want confrontation, but because they want resilience, and resilience requires options. The more investment channels Canada develops outside traditional structures, the less exposed it becomes to any single source of economic pressure. This is not necessarily about replacing the United States. That would be unrealistic. The American economy remains the largest and most important economic partner for Canada. Instead, this is about reducing concentration risk. And reducing concentration risk is one of the oldest principles in finance. Never depend entirely on one source, no matter how strong that source appears today. Now let's examine why analysts find this development so significant. Imagine four strategic sectors: energy, artificial intelligence, critical minerals, infrastructure. At first glance, they appear separate, but they are not. Artificial intelligence requires massive computing power. Computing power requires electricity. Electricity requires energy infrastructure. Energy infrastructure requires financing. Technology, manufacturing requires critical minerals. Critical minerals require mining investment. Mining investment requires transportation networks. Transportation networks require infrastructure funding. Each sector reinforces the others. The transcript describes precisely this interconnected model. AI development depends on energy, energy depends on minerals and infrastructure, and financing increasingly comes through diversified international channels. This creates a self-reinforcing system, and once such systems reach sufficient scale, reversing them becomes extremely difficult. Not impossible, but expensive, slow, and politically complicated. That is why infrastructure investments often matter more than short-term political disputes. Because infrastructure shapes future economic activity for decades. A pipeline can operate for generations. A port expansion may influence trade patterns for 30 years. An AI data center may attract entire clusters of new businesses. The effects compound. And compounding is one of the most powerful forces in economics. If the analysis presented in the transcript is correct, Washington's challenge is not tariffs, it is adaptation. Because traditional economic leverage assumes continued dependency. The transcript argues that policymakers gradually realized that diversification was becoming structural rather than temporary. That distinction matters enormously. Temporary diversification can be reversed. Structural diversification becomes embedded. Once major projects are financed, once contracts are signed, once infrastructure is built, once supply chains adjust, the economic system begins generating its own momentum, and momentum is difficult to stop, especially when multiple participants benefit simultaneously. This does not mean American influence disappears. Far from it. The United States remains the dominant economic power in North America. It remains Canada's largest trading partner. Its financial markets remain among the most important in the world. But influence is not binary. It exists on a spectrum. And even small reductions in dependency can create significant strategic flexibility. That flexibility may ultimately be Canada's most valuable asset. This story is actually much larger than Canada. It reflects a broader transformation occurring across the global economy. For decades, economic relationships were organized around a handful of major financial centers. Today, capital is becoming more multipolar. New investment hubs are emerging. Sovereign wealth funds are becoming increasingly influential. Middle Eastern investors are deploying unprecedented amounts of capital globally. Asian markets continue expanding. Technology is changing how investment opportunities are evaluated, and countries are increasingly seeking diversified partnerships rather than relying exclusively on traditional alliances. Canada appears to be positioning itself within that emerging reality, not abandoning old partnerships, but supplementing them, expanding them, strengthening them through diversification. That approach reflects a recognition that the world is becoming more complex, and in a complex world, flexibility often becomes a competitive advantage. The most remarkable part of this story is not the money, it is the strategy. Because while public attention focused on political conflict, another game was being played entirely, a game involving capital, infrastructure, long-term planning, and economic architecture. The transcript concludes with a powerful observation. Pressure loses effectiveness when the target becomes less structurally dependent on the source of that pressure. Whether Canada ultimately succeeds in this strategy remains to be seen. The United States will remain a dominant force. Cross-border economic integration will remain enormous, and North America's future will still be deeply interconnected. But one thing appears increasingly clear. The conversation is no longer simply about trade, it is about influence, it is about resilience, and it is about who controls the capital that will build the next generation of economic growth. The question now is no longer whether the global financial landscape is changing. The question is who will benefit most from that change. And perhaps more importantly, has Washington already underestimated how far Canada's transformation has progressed? What do you think? Is Canada successfully building long-term economic independence, or will the United States remain the unavoidable center of gravity for Canada's future? Let us know in the comments below.